Welcome, everyone. My name is Yuri Sokolov, and I'm a head of manual QA department here at Careerist. So today we will talk about very interesting subject, and it's a very important subject, test cases. So what are the best practices? How to write better test cases? Let me tell you right away that technically there is no right or wrong way of writing test cases, because there is no certain standard which is adopted by all the companies, all the software development companies everywhere in the world. So each company, and especially when you start your career in quality assurance, working for tech industry, you will see that every company will have their own specific approach towards test case documentation. And some companies will have their own standards, and other companies will have their own standards. It might be similar, might be different. So what we try to do is we try to create a guideline, which is compilation of all the best practices here in the industry of software development, and to present you for your consideration on how to be better in writing test cases, how to write really, really good test cases, and we think it's going to be super beneficial for your future career. All right, so let's start. Let's start with what is a test case. So test case, it's a short sequence of actions which verifies a specific feature or a program's functionality. In other cases, you may see it as test scenarios. Some companies call them test scenarios. Some companies call them use cases. There are slight differences between these, but it all boils down to the identification that the test case, it's a very, very short step-by-step instruction on how to test something. So let's talk about how does it work. So a few things that you need to understand and kind of try to memorize. The test case is a part of the test case, of the test documentation, which can be viewed or accessed by anyone in the company. In most of software development companies, management will introduce some form of a test case management system. For example, TestRail. Or bigger companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, they will have their own internal tools, which kind of going to be similar to TestRail. There are other different smaller websites and tools that do the same job. And that would be to keep all the test cases in one place, to make sure they're properly structured and that they can be accessed and previewed by anyone. And by anyone, I mean anyone from, let's say, design department, product department, development department, management department. CEO can preview test cases if he or she really needs it, right? So when we think about test cases, we should think about it as some part of the documentation, internal documentation that potentially anyone can preview. Okay, so the second thing is the test case includes the steps, title, data, prerequisites, and expected result necessary to verify a behavior. In some cases, there's going to be other different things like test case ID. There's going to be some other forms and parts of this case, but the most important ones are test case title, steps, and expected result. And we will discuss how to write them and what to include and how to make them look really, really nice, okay? Another important thing is something that you need to understand. Test cases can be created with or without the existence of documentation. What does it mean? It means that we as a QA engineers, we mostly rely on documentation that developers or product people provide to us when we write test cases. Sometimes, I've seen it quite a few times in many different companies, that developers will provide you already a set of test cases or test scenarios for you to look over, to go over, and maybe create test cases based on that documentation. In some companies, they will only provide you a PRD, product requirement document, and they will say, okay, well, just look at what we created and try to figure out what to test, like what test cases to create. In some cases, documentation is going to be super limited, or it may not be written properly, or maybe it's going to be too technical. So you'll have to pretty much rely on yourself when you will be creating test cases. Same goes to the product. So you will have access to the product and may not have too much useful information from documentation. So you'll have to basically get familiar with a feature or a product or a web page, play with it, explore it, and come up with your own test cases based on experience, based on your understanding of newly added feature, behavior, software, whatever, right? Final thing is, test cases are more often read rather than written, and it's really, really important for you to understand. So that's why it's super important for a test case to be easy to be read and understood, right? So everyone should be able to quickly read this case, understand what it does, and what is expected. Because in most cases, when you write some form of a test documentation, like a test case, it's gonna stay there for quite some time, 6 months, a year, maybe even longer. Some test cases, they rarely get deleted. And let's say QA department or someone who does testing, they will be reading those maybe even on daily basis. That's why writing a good test case, a best test case, it's very, very important. And today we will definitely talk about what is the best way of writing test cases. Okay, so let's start with the test case structure. Again, when you browse online, when you go for different forums and testing websites, they may say there are very, 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 very different structures of test cases. Some test cases may have, I don't know, 15 fields. It is true, but the core of test case consists of only few important components: title, precondition, steps, and expected results. That's pretty much all you need to have in order to have a pretty reliable, pretty extensive test case. Okay, so let's start with the first one. A title, it's a simple, self-explanatory sentence describing system behavior under specific conditions. The title is the most important part of the test case and is often underutilized. So guys, when you go to a system like TestRail, or if you go to a system like Jira or any other system, the way test cases are structured is there's going to be like a folder, or some form of folder, which will correspond to maybe a part of an application or maybe a part of the web page. And then you will have titles, test case titles, one by one. Okay, so realistically, you will read the title, and ideally, reading the title, and if a title is properly written, it's all you need to understand what needs to be tested, or remember, or realize what needs to be tested. Everything that's inside, it's secondary. If the title is nicely written, that's all you need to have. All right. So what is precondition? Precondition a lot of people are actually being a bit, I would say, confused about precondition. Why? Because there is no actual explanation of precondition is. It's a very tricky thing because one company may use precondition for one thing and another company may use precondition for another thing. But some companies may not use preconditions at all. So let's try to get through preconditions together as well. So precondition, it's a field where if it's applicable, it may not be applicable. The test case may not have preconditions. But if it does, it should include various conditions and states that the system should be in, or maybe the QA engineer should be in, before running the test case. So it should specify everything that is necessary, and this is specific to this test case. For example, it can include test data, right? Because the first thing we will see after the title when we look over the test case is precondition. Before we even go into the test steps, we see precondition. So with precondition has something very important that we should have as a QA engineers. It means that we need to first satisfy it before even moving to the test steps. Okay? So test steps, it's a list of sequential actions that must be taken to complete the test. It's very simple. It's a list of actions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'll show you what it's also a better way to write it, okay? Finally, expected result. So expected result explains the system behavior to the tester, which they should experience as a result of the test steps. So it's sometimes we call it a verification data or verification point or validation point or a verification result. So it's something that we need to describe, we see at the end to conclude if the test case passed or test case failed. Okay? All right, so let's start with the test case title. I call it do's and don'ts, right? So let's talk about don'ts first. So let's say we have a test scenario or scenario example. In front of us, it's a login page where we have username field, password field, and a login button. System allows existing user to log in to a website by entering a correct username, correct password, and clicking login button. And let's say our task, our job is to write a test case title for it. So again, and this is somewhat an actual example of what I've seen sometimes while working for software companies, because even some QA engineers with many years of experience, they do not have the best standard or best approach when it comes to test case conventions and test case writing. So let's see how not to write a test case title. Okay, first, it's very short. Some people will say login. Login doesn't tell, this is the title, login. It doesn't say anything to us. Is it a positive test case? If it's successful test case, what should happen after login? Who does the login? It says nothing. It's a very terrible, terrible way to write a title. Same goes for test login. As you can imagine, we can test login in many different ways. So test login also, it doesn't provide any information, specifics about what are we actually testing. Existing user login. Same thing, we have slightly more information. So now we say, okay, well, we should test something related to existing user. However, there are many different ways to test login form for existing user, many different test cases we can come up. Also, doesn't make much sense. Login button. So login button is, it's involved in our test case, right? But we have to be more elaborate. We have to provide way more information about How do we test login button? What should we expect from the login button? It is, again, not really well written. Login functionality, same thing. Login with valid credentials. So let me try to explain what we think is a better approach when it comes to test case titles. This is a test case title, how to write a better test case title. So it's a very simple system, and I'll try to explain what do I mean by it. Okay, so same scenario. We have login page, we have username, password fields, and a button which, when clicked, logs the user. System allows existing user to log into a website by entering a username and correct password and clicking login button. The best way to create a test case title, each should have three components in it, inside of the title. First, it's an object or it's a subject. It is something that we address, that's something that needs to do the action, or something we need to test, right? So we're kind of like addressing some user element, or we're addressing some form of a credentials, accounts, or maybe a web page system, but it needs to be addressed, needs to be named, right? So I call it an object. We can call it a subject. Second thing is an action or a behavior. So we need to add what we actually expect this element to do, or what should happen with our user, what should happen with our account or setting or a button or an image, whatever we are testing, whatever it's our object, we need to provide an explanation which behavior or functionality or action we're expecting to see, okay? And finally, what we need to also add is conditions. And conditions is like we need to explain under which condition our subject does certain action. And here are some examples. So let's go over these together. Verify user is, that's our action, able to log in, or behavior, right? So verify our subject user is able to log in with valid credentials. Condition, our condition here is valid credentials. Okay, so valid username, for example, valid password, or like valid account. Okay, another example is the system successfully logs in a user by accepting valid username and password. By the way, all these examples are actually a very decent examples of how we would write a test case title for this particular test scenario above, the one with the login page and username. So all these three examples are acceptable, and they're actually really good examples of how we would write a really nice test case title. So third example is verify user is taken to his account page after providing valid credentials. Okay, so again, we have a subject, we have action, and we have conditions. Okay, so let's continue to our next slide. More examples of test case titles in this particular example, unrelated to our test scenario. User is able to reorder a canvas print. Verify customer can share photos to another user's account. Clicking submit button takes user to a feedback form page. Validate that system successfully processes order after submitting all the details. Verify user is unable to submit a form without providing a valid zip code. So when it comes to test case titles, you can be as creative as you want to, right? But keep in mind that it's one of the most important parts of a test case, and it should be read and understood by pretty much anyone in the company. All right, so let's talk about preconditions and why do we need it? What is a precondition? Precondition, it's a combination of all necessary steps, actions, or conditions needed before running a test. Again, we don't always have to specify preconditions. Sometimes we don't have any preconditions. We can skip this part. Precondition, it's an amazing field that helps QA engineers in many ways. It helps to keep notes on what we need to have before reading that, trying to execute the test case. So anything that is going to be useful specific to this test case, we can add it there. Okay. So precondition helps QA engineers quickly identify all required actions needed before the test case can be run. Preconditions also help to shorten number of test case steps by offloading some of the actions into it. It's very a valid point. I can provide you a very simple example. Let's say we have a test case which says that our registered user, or logged in user, it's a good example, can go to the system and check email, right? So the test case will say something like verify logged in user is able to access, for example, email service, right? Let's say we don't use precondition here. So we go into steps. In order for us to explain that our user needs to log in, we should start by actually doing the whole login procedure. So step number one going to be go to the home page. Step number two going to be enter valid username. Step number three is going to be valid enter password. Number four, login, and so on. So we spent 5-6 steps only to log in, while it's technically not really a point of a test case. A point of a test case was to make sure that logged in user can actually access the email server, right? Or email field, email page. So we just spent 6 or 7 steps explaining that we need to log in. Too much steps, too many steps, too much information doesn't read good. Okay, what if we take the login function and we move it from our test steps into precondition? And we can say our precondition is user logged in, or it's an existing user that's logged in. Or we can just say login, right? So QA engineer, first of all, our test case is going to be much, much shorter. Second of all, it's going to be more logical because the test case, the QA engineer will look at prerequisites or precondition, and they will realize like, oh, okay, I need to have a registered user, a registered account. So they'll log in first, and then they will go and verify the steps that are actually related to a purpose of a test case. So this is an example how we can shorten our test cases by offloading some of those actions into precondition. And we don't really need to provide steps in the precondition because, as you can imagine, anyone in the company is somewhat familiar with the product. It is somewhat familiar with what are we doing there. So they should be able to understand what logged in user means, right? Or registered user or a guest user, right? They should be able to understand that. So we can only provide very simple one-liner instead of breaking it down into 15 different steps, which makes sense. Let's take a look at some pretty good examples of the use of a precondition field. I'm going to read the test case title and I'm going to read precondition. Verify registered user is able to purchase an item from the store page. So by reading this title, we can already see that we will need some form of account credentials for a registered user, right? And the second thing, since we want to test the purchasing, we will likely need some form of a test credit card or credit card that your company uses for testing or any other payment form. Yeah. So this is a good example how we can utilize precondition field. We can say, have a valid account credentials. We will need them. Have a valid credit card for testing. We will need it. Second example, which is kind of similar. Verify guest user is able to purchase an item from the store page. For a guest user, do we need a valid account credentials? No, we don't. It's a guest user. It's not registered user. But since we still have to test purchasing flow, we realize, okay, but we still need a valid credit card, or we still need a valid form of payment. So there it is. This is how you use precondition. Another example, user is able to upload a photo with the size greater than 5 megabytes, right? So we clearly understand as a QA engineer here. So if I'm a QA engineer, I read the test case title. User is able to upload a photo with the size, with an image, a file that is greater than 5 megabytes. Precondition should be have a photo, because preconditions are written for QA engineers. It's for us. It's for our own convenience. So precondition is going to be have a photo larger than 5 megabytes. Straightforward, understood, makes sense. You will definitely need it for this test. So realistically, as a QA engineer, I can read precondition, and if I understand that I don't have it, for me, it doesn't even make sense to write to read the test case steps or expected result. It doesn't matter if my precondition is not completed or satisfied. There's no there's no point wasting my time reading steps, which saves me some working time, right? Another example, a banned user is unable to log into the system. Same thing. We need to have an account that was banned. Okay, test account credentials. I hope that makes sense. All right, so let's discuss a few more things that are important. And those things are the components of a test case: steps and expected result. So as I mentioned earlier, each software company may have their own conventions on how to write test steps, verification points. But this is the example we think is fairly simple and easy to follow, and always will show your managers, your colleagues, that you know what you're doing, because this is kind of like the best practices on how to write certain things. So let's start with the steps. Sometimes there are cases where when you need to test certain functionality, certain behavior, there's a long way of actions that you need to perform. And sometimes QA engineers, they like to omit certain actions, and they kind of like start their steps in the middle of page hierarchy, or in the middle of some other action, and kind of it actually messes up the whole test case flow. So my rule of thumb is this: you always start writing test cases from the home screen or the home page. Okay, think about a product, a mobile application, or a website. Think about it as sort of like a box, right? Or we can say the folder. And there's the first screen, the home page. And then you click on the button, and then you go down the hierarchy. Then you go to another folder that has some more buttons. Then you click on those buttons, and you go to another folder. So it's a it's kind of like a flow system, right? There are many different folders, many different things under one home page. So my suggestion, personally, always start to write test case steps from the home page or the main screen. Whatever you see when you open your product, or whatever you see when you launch your application, should be your first step. So in this example, open the home page or go to the main screen. Then, for example, you need to access left side menu, right, to get to the store. So you say in the left side menu, click on store icon. Then on the store page, click on product item. And then on product item page, click buy button, and etc. Okay. Coming back to what I said at the beginning, test cases can be accessed by anyone. And in some instances, they will be accessed by, let's say, a new developer that just started working, or maybe new QA engineer. And their first job would be to, get familiar with test cases, get familiar with test documentation. They may not be experienced. They may not know all the flows, all the buttons, all the names of buttons. They can only follow very simple steps, what's in front of them. That's why when we create steps which are following the hierarchy of our product pages or websites pages, it will make absolutely clear to them what to do, what they see, and what they expect to see. Okay. Although there's no accepted limit or maximum number of steps, the industry standard should be under 10, 15. And this is true. Most of my test cases that I've written, I've probably had less than 6, 8, 7, 8 steps, maybe under 10. Usually you don't need to have like ridiculous amount of steps to explain how to get there, what to click, what to do. But this will give you a pretty good example, pretty good idea of how many steps you should include. Now, let's discuss expected results. And expected results are somewhat, it's an interesting subject, it's an interesting topic. And I worked for various companies here in Silicon Valley, and I've seen very, very much different ways of creating expected results. So again, depending on the company standards, there can be a few approaches for an expected result. Preferred method is to have one verification point per test case. So there is a test case that checks one, let's say, particular thing, right? So what makes sense is to have one verification point. However, based on all the experiences that I've seen in all the companies that I worked for, it is still acceptable to have as few or as many verification points as steps in the test case. So it's okay to have, even if you want to have just one main verification point or expected result, you can still add one or two extra ones if they're really, really important. Is that it's going to be a reminder to check something for you, right? To not forget that this also happens. So it's fine. In some cases, in some companies, the way they write their expected result is they write a verification point or expected result after each step. And it sounds a bit weird. And to me personally, I don't like this approach. I think it's messy. It makes a test case look heavy, and it may confuse testers, engineers, whatever. But in some companies, it's also accepted. So for each step, there's going to be a verification expected result. For example, step 1, open the homepage. Expected result for this step is going to be user sees the homepage or homepage loads. Number 2, we can say store icon is present for in the menu. To me, it doesn't really make much sense because it defeats the purpose of a test case. However, if your company, your future company of your choice is gonna be using this approach, well, you'll have to adapt, you'll have to adjust. All right, a subject that is really, really important, and again, sometimes misunderstood, misunderstood and underutilized. Let's talk about positive and negative test cases and test scenarios. First, let's try to understand what is a positive and what is a negative test scenario or a test case. So I'll try to explain. A positive test case, it's a test that verifies that system does what it's supposed to do. Positive testing, it's a test to make sure that something that should happen does happen when valid input is used. This is important, guys. We have a valid input which goes through the system or through our product, through our software. And what we verify is that the system proceeds to work like it's supposed to. For example, verify system allows user to log in with valid credentials. Okay? In this case, valid credentials, username and password, are something that our system considers a valid input. So our system processes valid input. And it lets users to log in. So it does what it's supposed to do. Okay? Let's look at what negative test case is. So negative test case tests that the system does not do things it shouldn't. Negative testing is the testing that something that should not happen does not happen when we use invalid input. Negative tests are mostly designed to make sure that we test errors, right? So it technically is considered an error handling tests, because when we have an invalid input and we provide this invalid input to our system, we feed it. We do not expect the system to proceed with an action, right? We basically expect the system to say, wait a minute, this is an invalid input. So I need to somehow say to user, so unfortunately, you cannot proceed with using the system because your input was invalid. For example, verify user is unable to log in with invalid credentials. We fed a system invalid credentials, username, wrong password, for example. Our system checked it and said, no, you cannot log in. This is what a negative test case is. You may ask a question, well, how do I know what is considered an invalid and what is considered a valid input? And the answer is here. Most test cases are going to be positive test cases. And in some cases, you may not even have an invalid input. For example, you need to test what a button does when you click it, right? Or you need to create a test case which explains how does the menu work. It's a simple button. It opens the menu. There is no invalid input. You click it and you expect to see a menu, okay? In most cases, when you will need to provide positive and negative tests, you will have it somewhere outlined somewhere in the documentation, or maybe your developers or product managers, they'll come up and say, okay, let's say we test, let's say you have a website which allows user to send a postcard when user provides a text and user provides an image, a photo. This is a system requirement. In this case, our system considers a valid input is a text provided by user and a photo or an image. These two things is what our system considers a valid input. If one of those things are not provided, let's say user adds the text but doesn't attach a photo, for our system it is invalid input, or the vice versa. User attaches attaches image photo but doesn't attach text. It is also by our system considered an invalid input. Okay, it's going to be much clearer when you will actually have an example you will be working with. You will see that, like, hey, oh, okay, so if the information our user provides is somewhat inaccurate or incomplete or is not accepted, we should check that our system behaves, handles this invalid input graciously, right? Let's see more examples of positive and negative test cases. Verify, it's a positive test case. Verify user is able to submit an order while having an item in the shopping cart. So we need to know, in this case, we understand that a system requires our user to have at least one item in the shopping cart for order to be submitted. And then let's verify with the negative test case, how does the system behave is if a shopping cart is empty. And again, here it's pretty straightforward as well. Verify that buy button is disabled if user's shopping cart is empty. So in this case, empty shopping cart for our system is invalid input, because it says I cannot let the user proceed with my checkout while not having any items in the shopping cart. That's just an example. Same goes for second test case. System accepts users with an age of 18 or older. So probably we will have a website where user should enter their date of birth, and system will check if the age of the user is 18 or older, it will accept it. It's a positive flow, it's a happy path. Negative, system does not allow access to any users under 18 years old. For this particular test case, we see that it's a negative testing, because we will need to provide, in order to test this, we will need to provide a date of birth of a user that's under 18 years old. Again, for example, and we'll see that what we expect to see is our system will not allow user to proceed. Another example, user A is able to make a call to user B if both of them are connected to Wi-Fi. What is our valid input here? Our valid input here is that both users are connected to Wi-Fi. If this condition is met, we expect that users can call each other. Invalid input here is, or we can say it's invalid condition mostly, that users are unable to call each other if one of them isn't connected to Wi-Fi. Okay, so even if one of them is not connected, it's an invalid. Technically, it's an invalid precondition, invalid behavior for our system. Okay. I hope this makes sense. But these are really, really nice examples of positive and negative tests. Again, in most cases, you will see that majority of this case is going to be positive, right? Negative test cases, you only need to specify them when there's certain checks you need to verify that they're working, that they're not let users to continue working with invalid inputs. All right, so actually we pretty much covered most of the subject of test cases, okay? Few additional recommendations. First, try not to use URLs or any other test data that isn't permanent. URLs tend to change and test data may become obsolete, login credentials and etc. Honestly, I've seen hundreds of examples where at my work or in my friends' companies, it is actually acceptable and common to use URLs. So they will add URLs into the precondition. They will add URLs in the test tabs, in the test data, expected result. But to me, it just doesn't make much sense. URLs are super easy to be changed, and it's really common for URL to change. Let's say you have a web page on your website, and it's going to be like, I don't know, 300 symbols long with all the folders and separate domain names. If developer changes one single character or maybe one folder in there, the hierarchy breaks. And when you will try to access this URL from your test data, it will be broken. Remember, I told you some test cases stay in the system for years. It means that when we write test case, we need to make sure that potentially there's not going to be anything there that will somehow break the test case. So again, while it is somewhat acceptable for some companies to do this, I strongly encourage you not to. Same goes for login credentials. Let's say test accounts, you should not really add to test case field. Test accounts tend to become obsolete. Same goes for credit cards, like testing credit cards, files, items. When you test, for example, a shopping website, don't use real product as a part of a test case, because I can guarantee you in 3 months it may not be there, or the product may change the name, and then your test case will break. Okay, so use something permanent. Don't be super specific when it comes to test cases. Use just generalized approach. Instead of using specific, let's say, name of a product, just say that they need to take any product or product for this category. No need to put like a URL of a product itself, because, well, maybe it's going to be sold out in 3 months, and then test case will not work. Another important thing, which I also want to stress, every test case should be independent and not connected to another. And I also have seen it at my work and other works. When a QA engineer writes, let's say they have a feature they need to create a set of test cases for. They sometimes write first test case, login, or test login. Second test case, so they assume that QA engineer completed the first test case, so they will write second test case with the connection to the first one. So the second test case is going to be test case for assuming that the user is already logged in, which they may even specify it in description or in precondition. And then they continue writing test cases, assuming it's all part of the same basically same test effort. It's not. Each test case should be independent and not related to previous or the next one. It is super common to retire test cases. So you have, let's say, 10 test cases, and maybe 2 of them or 3 of them will become obsolete or retired. It means that your whole sequence will break if you base your next test case on the previous one. So again, never connect your test cases to another test case. They all should be independent. A third thing, omit obvious things unless directly related to the test case. In some cases, inexperienced QA engineers, they may include, for example, in the field of precondition, they may include things like charge your phone, or like make sure you're internet connected, or make sure I don't know, your computer is turned on. Guys, while if we're being super picky, it is truly a precondition. Yes, we definitely need to make sure that our phone is charged before executing a test case. It is something of very, very obvious thing that we can probably omit. So try to be reasonable, realistic, use your common sense. Things that are super obvious, we can skip it. We all work in software development field. Everyone who will read your test case is working for a tech company. They know that they need to charge the phone in order to test it. Unless, for example, your test case specifically says that you need to perform some obvious thing or not perform obvious thing to test something. For example, you're testing a Wi-Fi router and it needs to be turned off. So your precondition would be like unplug your Wi-Fi router, right? Because the test case was specific to some obvious thing, like plugging or unplugging the router. Okay. Fourth thing, when you write test case titles or steps, instead of saying you are able to log in, use the word user or a customer is able to log in. Okay, try not to use words like you, me, them, and the same. Just use the word customer, client, user, system, etc. Final thing, and I get this a lot. How many test cases does one need? How many test cases should you write? The answer is it may be as few as just a couple or maybe 100. It depends. There is no right or wrong answer. There are projects which have thousands of test cases, total, thousands. There are projects that have under 100 test cases. Do your research first. Most likely, in 99% of the cases, when you will join a company as a QA engineer, they will already have some set of test cases. They will already have their QA engineers writing some of them. And you will get access to these right when you join. In fact, that's probably going to be the first thing they will introduce to you. They'll let you see. So it's your job to go throughout the folders, through all the parts of an application of the test case system they have, and see what is the acceptable number of test cases they are writing. You can always ask your colleagues, like, well, or QA managers, like, well, how many test cases do you want me to create? Because you can create, infinite number of test cases for every little detail. But we need to be, again, considerate and use common sense in our logical skills. So go to your test case and say, like, well, what is the acceptable number of test cases you want me to create? Go to your colleague. See, most likely just by going through existing set of test cases, you will already understand what is acceptable. You will see it. It's not going to be a problem. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I wish you a happy test case writing. It is, to me, it's personally one of the most fun part of this job. It lets you be creative and lets you use your logical skills. So please enjoy this presentation, rewatch it, and good luck. Thank you.